The snow fell like the earth was exhaling, soft and endless, wrapping the Montana Valley in a white hush that swallowed every sound except the slow, tired creak of pine branches bending under winter's weight. February 1889, the heart of what folks would later call the Great Winter, had buried the territory of Montana beneath drifts higher than a man's shoulder. The cold was a living thing, hunting warmth, finding it, extinguishing it with patient cruelty. Ruth Caldwell pulled her threadbare woolen scarf tighter around her face, her breath forming small clouds that dissolved into the gray morning. Her boots crunched through the surface crust as she made her way toward the church where she worked as a caretaker, the only employment the people of Clearwater would offer the widow of Samuel Caldwell. The stain caught her eye first, a stark, rust-colored splash against the pristine white. Blood, fresh enough that it hadn't been completely buried by the night's snowfall. Ruth stopped, her heart quickening. She knelt to examine it, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever she was reminded of Samuel's last days, of the blood that had soaked through their bed sheets as the fever took him. 10 months gone, but grief had a way of hiding in the shadows, waiting to ambush her in unexpected moments. More blood. Not just a single spot, but a trail leading away from the main path, up toward the ridge where the old Harrison cabin stood. Ruth straightened, scanning the distant tree line. The Harrisons were outcasts like herself, Charles and Abigail, an elderly couple whose son was whispered about in Clearwater with a mixture of fear and fascination. Gabriel Harrison, they called the man who walks with wolves, had disappeared into the wilderness after the war, returning only to bring supplies to his aging parents before vanishing again into the mountains. Ruth hesitated. Following a blood trail into the wilderness wasn't wise, especially for a woman alone, but something in her, the same something that had drawn her to Samuel's mission work, wouldn't allow her to turn away. "Lord," she whispered, "guide my steps." The climb was arduous. The blood trail appeared intermittently, sometimes disappearing beneath fresh powder only to resurface yards ahead. By the time the Harrison cabin came into view, Ruth's legs ached and her lungs burned from the frigid air. No smoke rose from the chimney, a bad sign in this killing cold. The door wasn't fully closed. Ruth approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello, Mr. Harrison? Mrs. Harrison?" When no answer came, she pushed the door open. The interior was dim and cold enough that her breath still clouded before her. A fire lay dead in the hearth, nothing but gray ash and a few blackened logs. In the weak light filtering through frost-covered windows, Ruth saw him. Charles Harrison, sprawled on the floor near a pile of uncut wood, a deep gash in his leg. Blood had pooled and begun to freeze on the rough-hewn floorboards. Across the room, Abigail Harrison sat motionless in a rocking chair, her thin blanket providing little protection against the cold, her eyes fixed on her husband with helpless worry. "Mrs. Harrison," Ruth said, rushing to the old woman's side tub. "What happened?" Abigail's lips were blue with cold, her voice barely audible. "Axe. Slipped. Tried to help. Too weak." Ruth didn't waste words. She moved quickly to Charles, kneeling beside him. He was conscious, but barely, his weathered face pale beneath his white beard. The wound was deep, but had begun to clot in the cold. Small mercies. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Ruth Caldwell. I'm going to help you." His eyes, cloudy with age and pain, found hers. "Samuel's wife," he whispered, recognition flickering across his face. Ruth felt a jolt of surprise that he knew who she was. She pushed the thought aside and set to work. She built a fire first, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Samuel had taught her well during their years together, traveling to remote settlements and Indian camps. Once flames began to lick at the dry kindling, she turned her attention to Charles's wound. The cabin slowly filled with warmth as Ruth cleaned and bandaged the gash, using strips torn from her own petticoat. She melted snow for water, found a small portion of beans and salt pork in the Harrisons' meager pantry, and set it to cook. As she worked, Abigail began to revive, color returning to her sunken cheeks. "You're an angel," the old woman murmured, watching Ruth tend to her husband. "The Lord must have sent you." Ruth smiled faintly. "I simply followed the blood in the snow." "Providence leaves its own trail," Abigail replied. By evening, Charles was propped up near the fire, weakened from blood loss but alert. Ruth had managed to get broth into both of them. Though she took none for herself, there was too little to share 3 ways, and she was younger, stronger. She could endure until she returned home. You shouldn't be up here alone, Charles said, his voice stronger now. The mountain's dangerous in this weather. I'll be fine, Ruth assured him, though the thought of the long walk back to her small cabin in the darkness made her stomach tighten. I just want to make sure you both have enough wood for the night. Our son, Abigail began, then hesitated. Gabriel brings supplies when he can, but this winter's been cruel. We haven't seen him in near 3 weeks. Ruth nodded, saying nothing. She'd heard the whispers about Gabriel Harrison, how he'd returned from the war changed, unable to abide the company of townsfolk, preferring the solitude of the high country where he trapped and hunted. Some said he'd gone half wild, living more like an Indian than a white man. Others claimed he'd been touched by something dark during the fighting, that he carried shadows no man should have to bear. Samuel had never mentioned knowing him, which struck Ruth as odd now that she thought about it. Her husband had known everyone in the region, especially those who lived on the fringes. I'll come back tomorrow, Ruth promised, stacking wood beside the hearth. Bring more food. Charles shook his head. You've done enough. We can't ask. You didn't ask, Ruth interrupted gently, and I can't leave you without help. As she prepared to leave, Ruth noticed a small shelf of books beside Abigail's rocking chair. Her gaze lingered on them, remembering how Samuel had treasured books, carrying them even when they had to abandon other possessions during their travels. Would you like me to read to you before I go? She offered. Just for a few minutes. Abigail's face brightened. That would be a blessing. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Ruth selected a worn Bible from the shelf, opening it to the Psalms, Samuel's favorite. As she turned the pages, something fell out, a folded letter, yellowed with age. And then she saw it, a name inscribed on the inside cover that made her breath catch. Samuel Caldwell, her husband's Bible. Here, in the Harrison cabin. Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she stared at the familiar handwriting. She glanced up to find both Harrisons watching her, Charles's expression guarded, Abigail softening with compassion. You didn't know, young, Gabriel said softly, that they knew each other. Ruth shook her head, unable to form words for a moment. Samuel never mentioned. They worked together, Charles explained, shifting uncomfortably, with the Blackfeet, during the worst of the smallpox. Ruth knew about Samuel's work with the Blackfeet tribe. It was what had turned much of Clearwater against him. A white preacher ministering to Indians was viewed with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. But he'd never spoken of having a partner in that work. Why would he keep that from me, she asked, more to herself than to the Harrisons. Charles and Abigail exchanged a look heavy with meaning. That's for Gabriel to explain, Charles finally said. Not us. Ruth carefully replaced the letter inside the Bible and set it down. Questions crowded her mind, but she could see the exhaustion settling over the elderly couple. They needed rest more than she needed answers. I should go before the trail becomes impossible to follow, she said, rising. I'll return in the morning. Outside, the temperature had dropped further, the night sky clear and pricked with hard, brilliant stars. Ruth pulled her coat tightly around her thin frame and began the treacherous descent, following her own tracks from earlier. The knowledge of her husband's Bible in that cabin weighed on her like a stone. The journey back took twice as long, the moonlight casting blue shadows that played tricks on her eyes. By the time she reached her own small cabin on the outskirts of Clearwater, her feet were numb and her fingers ached with cold. Inside was hardly warmer. She'd been gone all day, and the fire had died to embers. Ruth knelt at the cold hearth, working methodically to bring the flames back to life. As warmth slowly returned to the single room, she found herself staring into the fire, seeing Samuel's face in the dancing light. Samuel with his quiet conviction and gentle hands. Samuel, who had apparently shared his mission work with Gabriel Harrison, the man who walked with wolves. Why had he never told her? Sleep eluded Ruth that night. She rose before dawn, gathering what little food she could spare. A small sack of cornmeal, dried apples, a precious jar of honey saved for special occasions. She would bring these to the Harrisons, along with questions that only Gabriel could answer. The morning was still and cold, the snow having stopped sometime during the night. The town of Clearwater was beginning to stir as Ruth passed through, keeping her eyes lowered, her pace brisk. She'd learned months ago that acknowledging the stares and whispers only invited more. Mrs. Caldwell, the voice stopped her. Ezra Whitman, owner of the bank and chairman of the town council, stood in the doorway of his office. At 58, Whitman had the soft hands and hard eyes of a man who made his living from the hardship of others. It was his bank that had claimed the Caldwell's house after Samuel's death, forcing Ruth into the drafty cabin she now occupied. "Mr. Whitman," she acknowledged, not breaking her stride. He fell into step beside her. "Out early again. One might wonder where you go each day." Ruth kept her expression neutral. "I find walks help clear my thoughts. But you should know that the Harrison property will soon change hands. The old man hasn't paid his taxes in 2 years." Ruth felt her heart sink. "You're taking their land in the middle of winter?" "Business is business, Mrs. Caldwell. You of all people should understand that." His implication was clear, a reference to her own loss. Besides, that land has value beyond a dilapidated cabin. The railroad survey found copper deposits throughout that ridge. "So it's not about taxes at all," Ruth said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Whitman's expression hardened. "I'd be careful about making accusations, Mrs. Caldwell. Your position in this town is precarious. The church board only agreed to hire you out of respect for your late husband's position, despite his unconventional ministrations." The threat was unmistakable. Ruth's caretaker position at the church provided her only income, meager as it was. Without it, she would have nothing. "Good day, Mr. Whitman," she said firmly, continuing on her way. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called after her, "that wild son of theirs, he won't take kindly to your interference. Men who live in the wilderness tend to solve problems with violence. Remember that." Ruth didn't acknowledge his warning. She kept walking, her pace quickening as she left the town behind. The bundle of food seemed heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that the Harrisons faced not only hunger and cold, but dispossession as well. The climb to the Harrison cabin was no easier the second day. Ruth's muscles protested, still sore from the previous journey. But the sight of smoke rising from the chimney lifted her spirits. At least they'd managed to keep the fire going overnight. Abigail met her at the door, her thin face brightening. "You came back." "I said I would," Ruth replied, stepping inside. The cabin was warmer today, though still far from comfortable. Charles was asleep on a narrow cot, his breathing steady. "How is he?" "Better, thanks to you." Abigail took the bundle Ruth offered. "Child, you shouldn't have. You have so little yourself." "I have enough." Ruth removed her coat and scarf. "How long has it been since you have had a proper meal?" While Abigail rested, Ruth set about making a simple cornmeal porridge sweetened with a spoonful of honey. The familiar task calmed her, reminded her of mornings with Samuel, preparing breakfast before he would head out to his missionary work. As she stirred the thickening porridge, Ruth's gaze drifted to the shelf where she'd found Samuel's Bible. In the daylight, she could see other items that must have belonged to her husband. A compass she'd given him on their first anniversary, a small notebook he used for sermon notes. Abigail noticed her looking. "Gabriel brought those things after," she hesitated, "after your husband passed. Said Samuel would want Charles to have the Bible." Ruth nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "They were close then?" "Like brothers," Abigail confirmed. "For a time." Her eyes took on a faraway look. Samuel was the only one who could reach Gabriel after he came back from the war. "Something about your husband. He understood what others couldn't. And yet Samuel never mentioned him to me." Ruth couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. Abigail's expression softened. "Some men carry burdens they don't wish to share, even with those they love most. Especially with those they love most." Ruth served the porridge in the Harrisons' chipped bowls, waking Charles gently. As they ate, she told them about her encounter with Ezra Whitman, watching their faces fall at the news. "That man's had his eye on this land for years," Charles said bitterly, "waiting for us to die or give up." "Is it true about the copper?" Ruth asked. "There's copper all through these mountains," Charles confirmed. "But that's not why Whitman wants us gone." He set his empty bowl aside. "It's Gabriel. Whitman's afraid of him, of what he knows." "What does Gabriel know?" Charles shook his head. "That's not my story to tell." After the meal, Ruth helped Charles to a chair by the fire, checking his wound. The gash was healing cleanly, but he'd lost a lot of blood. He wouldn't be able to chop wood or hunt for weeks, if not months. You can't stay up here alone, not with Whitman threatening to take your land, and winter far from over. We've weathered worse, Charles insisted, though his weakened state belied his words. Ruth turned to Abigail. Let me help you. I can come every day, bring food, keep the fire going until Gabriel returns. Abigail clasped Ruth's hand in her gnarled fingers. Why would you do this for us? After all you've lost. Ruth thought of Samuel, of his unwavering belief in serving others, even when it cost him dearly. Because it's what Samuel would have done. And because, she paused, because I need to understand why you have his Bible. That afternoon, while Charles napped and Abigail dozed in her rocker, Ruth explored the cabin more thoroughly. It was sparsely furnished but had once been well kept. Handmade quilts, now worn thin, covered the beds. A few books, besides Samuel's Bible, lined the shelves. Poetry, a medical text, a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. On a small table near the window, Ruth discovered a wooden box. It wasn't locked, though something told her it was private. Her conscience warred with curiosity for a moment before curiosity won. She opened it carefully. Inside were letters, most in the same hand, dated during and after the war. From Gabriel to his parents. Ruth hesitated, then selected one from near the bottom of the stack, dated July 1865, just after the war's end. Dear Mother and Father, the war is over, though I cannot say the same for what it has done to men's souls. I write to tell you I will not be returning directly home. There is work still to be done here among the wounded. My medical training, limited though it was, is needed more than ever. A chaplain here, Samuel Caldwell, has been a light in this darkness. His faith remains unshaken despite all he has witnessed. I find myself envying that certainty, even as I question whether God could truly allow such suffering if he exists as Reverend Caldwell believes. We have agreed to work together once I am released from service, bringing aid to those forgotten by both armies. I do not know when I will see Montana again, but know that I am doing what I believe is right, even if my heart longs for the quiet of our mountains. Your loving son, Gabriel. Ruth read the letter twice, her mind racing. Gabriel had medical training. He and Samuel had met during the war. They had worked together afterward, but there was nothing in the letter that explained why Samuel would keep this friendship a secret from his wife. She returned the letter and was about to close the box when she noticed a folded paper different from the others. Not a letter, but a page torn from what appeared to be a journal. She opened it carefully, recognizing Samuel's handwriting immediately. Unlike his usual neat script, these words were scrawled hastily, the ink blotched in places. G. I cannot absolve you of what you believe you have done. That power belongs to God alone. But know this, I do not blame you for not being there. The decision was mine, as were the consequences. What happened among the Blackfeet was tragedy, not your burden to bear. I went knowing the risks. Your place was with your parents, just as mine was with the sick. My sin is not in dying, but in the pride that made me believe I alone could save them. Perhaps that is what we both must reconcile, that we are merely men, not saviors. When you read this, I will likely be gone. Tell Ruth I loved her beyond words, and know that I consider you a brother until the end. See, Ruth's hands trembled as she refolded the page, her vision blurring with tears. Samuel's last message, not to her, but to Gabriel. What had happened between these men? What burden did Gabriel believe he carried? And most painful of all, why had Samuel's final words of love for her been entrusted to a man she'd never met? The creak of the cabin door startled Ruth. She quickly replaced the paper in the box and turned toward the sound. Cold air rushed in, carrying snowflakes and the scent of pine. In the doorway stood a tall figure, broad-shouldered and imposing, his beard crusted with ice. His eyes the color of a winter sky. A rifle was slung over his shoulder and dead rabbits hung from his belt. Gabriel Harrison had returned. For a long moment, he didn't seem to register Ruth's presence, his gaze moving to his father asleep by the fire, his mother just now stirring from her nap. Then his eyes locked with Ruth's, and something like recognition, or was it fear, flashed across his weathered face. Abigail woke fully, her expression lighting with joy. Gabriel, you've returned! He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, never taking his eyes off Ruth. "Who is this?" he asked, though from the tightness in his voice, Ruth suspected he already knew. "Ruth Caldwell," Abigail said, a note of caution entering her voice. "Samuel's wife. She found your father yesterday, hurt from the axe. She saved him, Gabriel." Charles awakened at the sound of voices, struggling to sit up straighter. "Son," he said, his voice stronger than it had been the day before, "Mrs. Caldwell has been a godsend." Gabriel said nothing. He set his rifle in the corner, hung the rabbits on a hook by the door, and removed his heavy coat. His movements were fluid, economical, like those of a wild animal. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. "Thank you for helping my parents," he finally said, his deep voice rough from disuse. "But we don't need charity." The words stung Ruth like a slap. "It isn't charity, Mr. Harrison. It's what?" he interrupted, an edge to his voice. "Christian duty, neighborly concern. The town made it clear long ago what they thought of us. Why the sudden change of heart?" "Gabriel," Abigail chided softly, "Ruth has been nothing but kind." "I found your father bleeding in the snow," Ruth said evenly, meeting Gabriel's hard gaze. "I didn't stop to consider town politics." Gabriel studied her, his expression unreadable. There was something in his scrutiny that made Ruth feel exposed, as though he could see past her words to the questions burning inside her. "You have my thanks," he said finally, though his tone remained cool. "But now that I'm here, you can return to town with a clear conscience." Ruth felt a flare of indignation. "My conscience was clear before I climbed this mountain, Mr. Harrison, and I promised your parents I would return tomorrow with more supplies." "That won't be necessary." "Gabriel," Charles interjected, his voice firm despite his weakness. "Enough. Mrs. Caldwell has shown us more kindness in 2 days than we've seen in years. You will treat her with respect." A muscle worked in Gabriel's jaw, but he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement of his father's rebuke. The tension in the room was palpable, like the charged air before a lightning strike. "I should go," Ruth said, reaching for her coat. "It'll be dark soon." "I'll walk you down," Gabriel offered unexpectedly. "The trail's dangerous after snow." Ruth wanted to refuse, to prove she needed no escort, but practicality won out. The descent was treacherous, and she'd been fortunate to make it up and down safely once already. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her scarf around her neck. Abigail embraced her warmly. "God bless you, child. Come back to us." "I will," Ruth promised, though she felt Gabriel's disapproving gaze on her back. Outside, the afternoon was waning, the forest already deepening with shadows. They walked in silence, Gabriel a few paces ahead, breaking trail through the fresh snow. Despite his size, he moved with a quiet grace, his footfalls almost soundless. "You knew Samuel," Ruth said when they were halfway down the mountain, unable to contain the question any longer. Gabriel didn't slow or turn. "Yes. He never mentioned you." Now he did stop, looking back at her with those winter sky eyes. "Is that why you're really helping my parents, to learn about Samuel's secrets?" The accusation stung because there was a kernel of truth in it. "No," she said, "but finding his Bible in your cabin, yes, that raised questions. Questions best left unanswered." Gabriel resumed walking. "He was my husband," Ruth persisted, hurrying to keep pace. "I have a right to know." "Know what?" Gabriel's voice had an edge like broken glass. "That your husband was a better man than most? That he died trying to save people the town would rather see disappear? You already know that." "I found his letter to you," Ruth admitted. "His last letter." Gabriel stopped so abruptly that Ruth nearly collided with him. He turned slowly, his expression a mixture of anger and something deeper, more painful. "You had no right," he said quietly. "Neither did you," Ruth countered. "No right to keep his final words from me. Tell Ruth I loved her beyond words. That's what he wrote to you. Why didn't you tell me?" Gabriel's face was like stone. "Because by the time I received it, you were already being shunned by the town." Ruth nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution, even as she chafed at the necessity. "Will you allow me to continue helping your parents?" she asked. Gabriel studied her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Why would you want to? After everything the town has taken from you because of Samuel's work with the Blackfeet?" Why risk more? Ruth thought of Samuel, of his unwavering conviction that love must be shown through action, not just words, of his belief that every person, regardless of their past or position, deserved compassion. Because it's what Samuel would have done, she said simply, and because your parents shouldn't suffer for choices made by others. Gabriel was silent for a long moment, the wind lifting strands of his dark hair. Finally, he nodded. Come tomorrow, then. But be careful. Ezra Whitman has wanted our land for years. He won't take kindly to your interference. He's already warned me away, Ruth admitted. And still you came. There was a note of reluctant admiration in Gabriel's voice. Samuel chose his wife well. Before Ruth could respond, he had turned and disappeared into the gathering dusk, as silent as the falling snow. She stood watching the place where he had vanished, feeling as though she'd glimpsed something rare and wild, like a wolf passing through a clearing, acknowledged but untamed. With a sigh, Ruth turned toward Clearwater, toward her cold cabin and the whispers that would greet her in the morning. But for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt a spark of purpose beyond mere survival. The Harrisons needed her, and somewhere in the tangle of connection between Gabriel and her husband lay answers she was determined to find. As she walked, snowflakes began to fall once more, erasing her footprints behind her. Above, the first stars appeared, cold and distant in the darkening sky. Ruth pulled her coat tighter against the chill, but the cold she felt most deeply came not from the winter air, but from the knowledge that Samuel had entrusted his final words of love to a man who had kept them locked away, as securely hidden as whatever secret bound the two men together. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of day when breath froze in the air and the snow squeaked underfoot like tiny screams. Ruth woke before sunrise, her small cabin never quite warm despite her efforts. She dressed quickly, layer upon layer of worn clothing, her fingers stiff as she buttoned her coat. The previous day's encounter with Gabriel Harrison had left her unsettled, questions multiplying like shadows at dusk. She had known men like him before, men the war had hollowed out, leaving them shells filled with memories too heavy to carry. Samuel had ministered to many such men. They're not angry, he would say, they're haunted. But Gabriel's reaction to her felt personal, as if her very existence was a reproach. The walk to the Harrison cabin was becoming familiar now, her body remembering where to place each step. Ruth carried a basket covered with a cloth, cornbread she'd baked before dawn, using the last of her cornmeal, and dried venison a sympathetic neighbor had given her months ago. Food she'd been saving for an emergency. The Harrison situation certainly qualified. Halfway up the slope, Ruth paused, something catching her eye in the pristine snow. Tracks, not human, but animal, large paw prints circling back toward the Harrison cabin. Wolf. She'd heard stories of wolves growing bold during hard winters, venturing closer to human dwellings in search of food. Ruth quickened her pace, worry for the elderly couple overriding her caution. When the cabin came into view, Ruth stopped short. Gabriel stood outside, bareheaded despite the cold, facing the tree line. Before him, at the edge of the clearing, stood a gray wolf, its coat silver in the morning light. Man and beast regarded each other with an unnerving stillness, neither advancing nor retreating. Then, with a flick of its tail, the wolf melted back into the shadows between the pines. Gabriel remained motionless a moment longer before turning, as if sensing her presence. His face betrayed no surprise at finding her there. "They're hungry too," he said, nodding toward where the wolf had disappeared. "It didn't fear you," Ruth observed, approaching slowly. "It should. I've killed enough of its kind." His voice held no pride in the statement, only a grim acknowledgement. "But this one knows me. We've reached an understanding." Ruth wasn't sure what to make of that. "I've brought food," she said, lifting her basket slightly. Gabriel's gaze lingered on it before meeting her eyes. "You didn't need to. Your father's still healing. Your mother's too weak to cook. And you can't be here all the time." Each reason laid out simply, leaving no room for argument. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression. Not softening exactly, but a slight easing of the guardedness. "Come in then. It's too cold to stand about." Inside, the cabin was warmer than it had been the previous days. A proper fire roared in the hearth, and the scent of pine resin filled the air. Abigail brightened at the sight of Ruth, rising from her rocker with more energy than before. "Child, you came back," she said, embracing Ruth warmly. As promised, Ruth set her basket on the rough table. "How is Mr. Harrison today?" "Stubborn," Gabriel answered before his mother could, though there was a hint of fondness in his tone. "Trying to get up when he should be resting." Charles, propped up in bed, scowled good-naturedly. "I'm not dead yet, boy. A man needs to move about." Ruth unwrapped the cornbread, its golden crust still warm from her oven. "Perhaps Mr. Harrison could sit by the fire while I check his wound. Movement is good for healing, as long as it's not too much." Gabriel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her knowledge. Ruth felt a flicker of satisfaction at having unsettled his assumptions. "Samuel and I worked with the sick," she explained, meeting his gaze steadily. "I learned what I could." Something passed across Gabriel's face, a shadow of recognition, quickly masked. He nodded once, then moved to help his father from the bed to a chair near the hearth. While Ruth examined Charles's leg, finding the wound healing well with no signs of infection, Abigail set about slicing the cornbread and preparing a simple meal from what Ruth had brought and Gabriel's rabbits from the day before. "You're good at this," Charles commented as Ruth redressed his wound with clean cloth. "Gentle hands." "My father was a doctor," Ruth replied. "Before the war took him, I used to help in his surgery sometimes." "Samuel mentioned that," Abigail said, setting plates on the table. "Said you had a healer's touch." Ruth glanced up, caught Gabriel watching her intently. "You spoke of Samuel often then?" she asked, unable to keep the question inside. An uncomfortable silence fell. Abigail looked to her son, who had turned away to stare into the fire. "When Gabriel came home last year," Charles finally answered, "Samuel had just taken ill. Your husband was a frequent topic." Before Ruth could ask more, Gabriel spoke, his back still to them. "We should eat before it gets cold." The meal passed in strained conversation, primarily between Ruth and the elder Harrisons. Gabriel ate silently, his attention seemingly focused on his food, though Ruth sensed his awareness of every word exchanged. Charles spoke of the town in earlier days, when the mining camps were just beginning and Montana was still wild territory. Abigail shared stories of raising Gabriel in this very cabin, teaching him from the few books they owned. "He could recite Wordsworth by the time he was 10, she said proudly. "Always had a mind for beautiful things, despite his father's efforts to make a miner of him." Gabriel's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Pa wanted me practical. You wanted me poetical. I ended up neither." "You ended up alive," Charles said firmly. "After that war took so many. That's enough." Another silence fell, heavier than before. Ruth thought of the letter she'd read, Gabriel's mention of working with the wounded after the war. There was more to this man than the wild hermit of town gossip. After the meal, Gabriel announced he needed to check his traps. "I'll be back by nightfall," he told his parents. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'll walk you down when I return." "I can find my own way," Ruth said. "Not in the dark," he replied, his tone brooking no argument. "The mountain's treacherous after sunset." With that, he took his rifle and left, the door closing firmly behind him. Abigail sighed once he'd gone. "You must forgive him his manner," she said, patting Ruth's hand. "The war changed our boy. And then what happened with Samuel?" She trailed off, looking uncertain. "What did happen?" Ruth asked gently. "Please, Mrs. Harrison, I need to understand." Abigail exchanged a look with her husband. Charles nodded slightly. "She has a right to know, Abby, even if Gabriel won't tell her." Abigail settled into her rocker, her aged face solemn in the firelight. "Gabriel and Samuel met during the worst of the fighting, Spotsylvania, I believe. Gabriel was working as a field surgeon's assistant, though he had no formal training. Samuel was a chaplain. They found common ground in trying to ease suffering." Ruth nodded, picturing Samuel moving among wounded soldiers, offering comfort where medicine failed. "After the war," Abigail continued, "they stayed in touch through letters. Samuel would write of his missionary work, Gabriel of his struggles to find purpose. When Samuel married you and came west to work with the Blackfeet, Gabriel was already here with us. They reconnected, found they still shared a calling to help those others overlooked. But Samuel never mentioned him to me," Ruth said, the hurt still fresh. Charles leaned forward in his chair. "Because Gabriel asked him not to. He wanted no recognition, no connection to town or church. The war had changed his relationship with God, with people. He preferred to work in shadow. Ruth absorbed this, trying to reconcile the image of her open, forthright husband, keeping such a significant relationship hidden. And when Samuel fell ill, where was Gabriel then? Abigail's eyes filled with tears. Charles answered, his voice rough with emotion. Here, with us. We were both down with pneumonia. Gabriel had just returned from a hunting trip to find us near death. He couldn't leave. He wrote to Samuel, Abigail added, explained why he couldn't come. But by then, she couldn't finish. By then, Samuel was already gone, Ruth completed quietly. The elderly couple nodded in solemn unison. The letter you found, Charles said, the one Samuel wrote to Gabriel. It came after, carried by a Blackfoot man who'd been with Samuel at the end. Gabriel read it once and never spoke of it again. But he changed after that, grew harder, more distant, started spending weeks alone in the high country. Ruth sat in silence, pieces falling into place. Gabriel blamed himself for not being with Samuel during the outbreak. And Samuel, even in death, had tried to absolve his friend of that guilt. Why didn't Gabriel come to me afterward, she asked finally, to deliver Samuel's message? He tried, Abigail said softly, twice. But the town had already turned against you for Samuel's work with the Indians. Gabriel was seen as worse, half wild, dangerous. He feared his presence would only make your situation more difficult. Ruth remembered those dark days after Samuel's death, the cold shoulders at the church where he'd once preached, the whispers that followed her through town, the slow, deliberate dismantling of their life together as debts were suddenly called due and promises forgotten. Ezra Whitman, she said, the name bitter on her tongue. He led that effort. Charles nodded grimly. Whitman never approved of Samuel's mission, said it was stirring up trouble with the Indians. When the sickness came and Samuel died trying to help them, Whitman painted it as divine judgment and used it as an opportunity to claim your land, Ruth added, thinking of her own loss. Whitman has always wanted this mountain, Charles confirmed. The copper's just his latest excuse. Before that, it was timber. Before that, water rights. The truth is he wants control. Men like him can't abide anyone living beyond their reach. They talked until afternoon, Ruth helping with small tasks around the cabin while learning more about the Harrisons' history in the valley. Charles had come west in 1848, right after the Mexican War, staking his claim on the mountain when Montana was still part of the Oregon Territory, not yet even Washington Territory. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, married Abigail when she came out to teach at the Territorial School in '52. For nearly half a century, he'd worked this land, watching territories form and reform around him. Gabriel had been born here in 1855, raised in the shadow of these peaks until the Civil Wars called him east at 19. He volunteered, Abigail said, a lingering disbelief in her voice. He was only 19, so full of ideals about preserving the Union. I don't want to impose. Nonsense, Charles interjected. We have room, and I'd not sleep a wink knowing you were out on that mountain in the dark. Ruth hesitated, thinking of her own cold cabin. There was nothing pressing awaiting her there, and the thought of the Harrisons alone, should Gabriel not return, decided her. Thank you, she said. I'll stay until he comes back. Night fell completely, the cabin illuminated only by firelight in a single oil lamp. They ate the stew, saving a portion for Gabriel. Afterward, Ruth read aloud from Samuel's Bible, the familiar Psalms bringing comfort to all three. When Charles began to doze in his chair, Ruth helped Abigail settle him back in bed. You take Gabriel's bed, Abigail instructed, pointing to a narrow cot in the corner. He often sleeps by the fire when he's here, which isn't often enough. Ruth was too tired to argue. The day's emotional revelations had drained her more than the physical labor. She removed her boots and outer layers, slipping beneath the rough blankets of Gabriel's cot. The pillow carried a faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Despite her worry for Gabriel's absence, exhaustion soon pulled her into sleep. She dreamed of Samuel, not as he was at the end, ravaged by fever, but as he had been in their early days together, his eyes alight with purpose and love. In the dream, he stood on a mountaintop, gesturing for her to join him. But when she reached the summit, it was Gabriel who waited, his face solemn in the dreamlight. He sent me to bring you home, the dream Gabriel said, extending a hand. Ruth woke with a start, momentarily disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. And there, silhouetted against the dim red glow of the embers, sat Gabriel. He was in a chair near the hearth, elbows on knees, head bowed. In his hands was Samuel's Bible, open to a page Ruth couldn't see from where she lay. His posture spoke of exhaustion, of a burden carried too long. As Ruth watched, he traced a finger over the page, a gesture so gentle it made her chest ache. She must have made some small sound, for he looked up suddenly, closing the Bible with careful hands. "You stayed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth sat up slowly, mindful of the sleeping couple across the room. "Your parents were worried. It seemed wrong to leave them alone." Gabriel nodded, returning the Bible to its place on the shelf. "The traps were empty. I widened my circle, trying to find game. Time got away from me." "You found something, though." It wasn't a question. The front of his coat was darker in places, the unmistakable stain of blood. "Deer," he confirmed. "Young buck, caught in a drift, already weakened from hunger." He gestured toward the door. "It's hanging in the shed now. Will see us through a few weeks, if we're careful." Us. The word hung between them, unexpectedly inclusive. Gabriel stirred the embers, adding a small log. The fire flared briefly, illuminating his face. In the dancing light, with his guard momentarily lowered, Ruth could see echoes of the young man Abigail had described, the one who recited poetry and volunteered out of idealism, the one who had been Samuel's friend. "Your parents told me," Ruth said quietly, "about you and Samuel." Gabriel's shoulders tensed, but he didn't look at her. "I figured they might." "Why didn't you come to me?" The question that had burned in her since discovering the letter. With his message. For a long moment, Gabriel was silent, staring into the rekindling flames. When he finally spoke, his voice had a roughness that hadn't been there before. "I tried. Twice." He exhaled slowly. "The first time you were surrounded by church ladies after the funeral. They were already looking at you differently, like Samuel's death had made you contagious somehow. I knew what would happen if the wild man from the mountain approached the preacher's widow." Ruth remembered that day in fragments. The raw wound of grief, the hollow platitudes offered by people who had already begun to distance themselves. She had been aware of little beyond her own pain. "And the second time?" she asked. "A month later, I came to your house, the bigger one before Whitman took it. You were in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, crying." Gabriel's voice grew quieter. "You looked so broken. I couldn't bring myself to intrude on that grief with my own." The memory surfaced in Ruth's mind. A spring day, trying to save Samuel's vegetable garden even as she felt her own life withering. She'd wept among the tender shoots, overwhelmed not just by loss, but by what she couldn't tell anyone. "I was pregnant when Samuel died," Ruth said, the words emerging before she could reconsider. "No one knew. I hadn't even told him yet. Wanted to be certain before giving him that joy." Gabriel looked at her then, surprise evident in his expression. "I lost the baby," Ruth continued, her hands instinctively moving to her belly, empty now of the promise it had once held. "A month after the funeral. There was no one I could tell. The town had already decided I was tainted somehow by Samuel's work." "I'm sorry," Gabriel said, and the simple words carried genuine weight. "Samuel would have been a good father." "Yes," Ruth agreed, a sad smile touching her lips. "He talked about children often, a house full of them, learning and laughing. The dream that had died with him, and then again with her miscarriage." They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling softly, the wind outside a distant moan around the eaves. "Why did you keep it?" Ruth finally asked. "His Bible. Why not bring it to me with his message?" Gabriel's gaze returned to the shelf where the book rested. "Because it was the last piece of him I had. Selfish, I know." He ran a hand over his beard. "And because I needed his words more than I thought you did. I do not blame you. I've read that line 1,000 times, never quite believing it." "What happened?" Ruth asked. "With the Blackfeet, Samuel's letter mentioned a tragedy." Gabriel's expression closed like a shutter drawn against a storm. "That's not a story for tonight." Ruth wanted to press, but something in his face warned against it. Instead, she asked, "Will you tell me someday?" Perhaps. He stood, stretching his tall frame. You should sleep. Morning comes early on the mountain. Ruth settled back against the pillow, watching as Gabriel spread his bedroll near the fire. Thank you, she said softly, for trying, even if you didn't reach me. He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features, before nodding once in acknowledgement. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep, the lines of his face softening in the fading firelight. Ruth lay awake longer, piecing together this new understanding of the connection between her husband and the man sleeping across the room. Two men bound by war and purpose, separated by circumstance at the crucial moment. And now she and Gabriel were similarly bound, by Samuel's memory, by loss, by the shared burden of survival in a world that had taken more than it had given. She slept dreamlessly after that, waking to the pale light of dawn filtering through frost-covered windows. The cabin was empty, save for Charles, still asleep in his bed. A note rested on the table in angular handwriting. Gone hunting. Mother with me. Back by noon. G. Ruth set about rebuilding the fire and preparing a simple breakfast from the previous day's leftovers. She checked Charles's wound again, pleased to find it continuing to heal cleanly. You're a natural nurse, the old man commented as she replaced the bandage. Steady hands, gentle touch. I had practice, Ruth replied. The Blackfeet camps were often full of sick children. Charles studied her thoughtfully. You went with Samuel then? To the reservation? When I could, Ruth said, remembering those journeys, difficult but fulfilling. The women were wary at first, but came to accept me. I learned as much from them as they did from us. That's why the town turned on you both, Charles said, his tone matter of fact. Folks here don't mind Indians staying on their reservation, but white people who cross that line, who treat Indians as equals, that frightens them. Ruth nodded, having come to the same conclusion months ago. Samuel believed God made no distinctions among his children, that all souls were equal in his sight. A dangerous theology in these parts, Charles observed. Worth dying for, Samuel would say. Ruth's voice caught slightly, though I sometimes wonder if he knew how high the cost would be. Charles reached out, his weathered hand covering hers. Gabriel was with him, you know, at the beginning of the outbreak. They worked together for 3 days straight, trying to contain it. Gabriel only left because word came that Abigail and I were ill. He made Samuel promise to send for him if things worsened. But Samuel never did, Ruth guessed. No, he wouldn't put Gabriel at risk, just as he tried to keep you away during the worst of it. Charles's eyes held a knowing look. Samuel protected those he loved, sometimes at his own expense. Before Ruth could respond, the door opened, admitting Gabriel and Abigail. They carried bundles of kindling and pine boughs, their cheeks red from the cold. Good morning, Abigail greeted cheerfully. We've brought Christmas inside since we can't go to it. Ruth looked at her in surprise. Is it so near? 3 days away, Gabriel confirmed, setting his bundle by the hearth, though we've never been ones for elaborate celebration. Samuel loved Christmas, Ruth said, the memory bittersweet. We always had a small tree, even when we were traveling. He'd find one somewhere, decorate it with whatever was at hand. Then we shall have one too, Abigail declared, arranging the pine boughs in a corner of the cabin. In his memory. The day passed in quiet industry. Gabriel butchered the deer, preserving what meat they wouldn't use immediately. Ruth helped Abigail fashion simple decorations for their makeshift Christmas tree. Pine cones dipped in flour to look snow-covered, strips of red cloth tied in bows, a star cut from tin and polished to shine in the firelight. As the afternoon waned, Ruth reluctantly prepared to leave. I should get back before dark. I've imposed long enough. Nonsense, Abigail protested. You've been a blessing. Nevertheless, Ruth insisted gently, I have duties at the church tomorrow morning. The Christmas Eve service preparations. I'll take you down, Gabriel said, reaching for his coat. There's still an hour of light left. The descent was easier with Gabriel breaking trail ahead of her. The sky was clear, the air still, the world around them transformed into a crystalline palace of snow and ice. They walked in companionable silence until they reached the edge of town. I'll come up again the day after tomorrow, Ruth said, as they paused at their usual parting place. After the Christmas services. Gabriel nodded. My parents would like that. A slight hesitation, then, as would I. The admission, small as it was, warmed Ruth more than she expected. Gabriel, she began, uncertain how to phrase what she wanted to say. Thank you for what you tried to do for Samuel, and for what you did for me, even though I didn't know. He looked away, uncomfortable with the gratitude. I failed you both. No, Ruth said firmly. Samuel didn't see it that way. Neither do I. Gabriel met her gaze then, his eyes troubled beneath their habitual guardedness. You don't know everything. Then tell me, she challenged gently, when I return. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Perhaps it's time, if you still want to hear it afterward. I will, Ruth assured him, though uncertainty flickered at his ominous tone. They parted ways, Ruth continuing toward Clearwater, while Gabriel melted back into the forest with that same fluid grace she'd noticed before. She walked briskly, the temperature dropping as the sun dipped toward the mountains. The town was quiet in the late afternoon, smoke rising from chimneys, windows glowing with early lamplight. As Ruth passed the church, the door opened, spilling golden light onto the snow. The Reverend's lips thinned. Mrs. Caldwell, I've tried to be understanding of your situation. The church board agreed to employ you out of respect for your late husband's position, but there are limits to Christian charity. I wasn't aware that helping the sick and elderly exceeded those limits, Ruth replied, keeping her tone even, despite the anger building in her chest. When those individuals are associated with someone of questionable character, yes, it becomes problematic. Pierce drew himself up, particularly when that association reflects on the church. My work with the Harrisons is my own affair, Ruth said. It has nothing to do with my duties here. Everything you do reflects on this church, Mrs. Caldwell, especially given your husband's controversial legacy. The Reverend sighed as if pained to continue. The board has expressed concern. Mr. Whitman in particular feels your behavior shows poor judgment. Of course Whitman was behind this. Ruth fought to keep her expression neutral. What exactly are you saying, Reverend? I'm saying choices have consequences, Mrs. Caldwell. His tone was gentle now, which somehow made it worse. If you wish to retain your position here, you would be wise to reconsider your charitable activities. The implication was clear. Abandon the Harrisons or lose her livelihood. Ruth felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. I'll give it thought, she said finally, not trusting herself to say more without revealing her anger. Please do, before Christmas Eve service. Pierce nodded once, then retreated into the church, closing the door firmly behind him. Ruth continued to her cabin, her mind racing. The small salary from her church position was her only income, barely enough to keep her housed and fed through winter. Losing it would be disastrous, but abandoning the Harrisons now, when they'd come to rely on her when she'd promised to return, was unthinkable. Samuel would never have yielded to such pressure. He had always chosen principle over expediency, compassion over convenience. It had cost him his reputation, ultimately his life. And now, it seemed, his legacy was threatening what little security Ruth had left. Inside her cabin, Ruth built a fire with trembling hands, her thoughts churning. The cold emptiness of the single room struck her anew after the warmth of the Harrison home. Here, there were no gentle conversations by firelight, no shared meals, no sense of purpose beyond survival. As the flames caught, Ruth sank to her knees, bone-tired and soul-weary. Samuel, she whispered to the empty room, what would you have me do? No answer came, of course, but as she gazed into the fire, Ruth thought of Gabriel reading Samuel's Bible by firelight, seeking guidance from the words her husband had treasured. She thought of Charles and Abigail, who had lost everything but each other, facing dispossession in their final years. And she thought of the baby she had never held, the future that had slipped away with Samuel's last breath. How much more could she lose? What else could they take from her that they hadn't already? The answer came with unexpected clarity. Her integrity. The one thing Samuel had valued above all else. The one thing he had never compromised, even when it cost him everything. Ruth rose, decision made. She would return to the Harrisons after Christmas Eve service, regardless of the Reverend's warning. She would help them through the winter, as Samuel would have done. And if that cost her the church position, so be it. She had survived loss before. She would survive again. The next morning dawned bright and bitter, the temperature having dropped further overnight. Ruth dressed for church duties, her movements deliberate, her resolve firm. As she walked through town, she was acutely aware of the glances cast her way, the whispers that followed her passage. News traveled quickly in small communities. At the church, Ruth found Reverend Pierce speaking with Ezra Whitman on the steps. Both men fell silent as she approached, their expressions making it clear they had been discussing her. "Mrs. Caldwell," Whitman greeted, his smile not reaching his eyes. "We missed you at the town council meeting last evening. Your situation was a topic of some concern." "My situation?" Ruth repeated, keeping her tone neutral. "Your association with the Harrisons." Whitman adjusted his expensive coat. "Given your position with the church, it raises questions about judgment, about loyalty to this community." Ruth met his gaze steadily. "My loyalty is to the principles my husband taught, service to those in need regardless of their standing in society." Whitman's smile tightened. "Noble sentiments, but practical considerations must also prevail. The Harrisons' property, for instance, did you know it's scheduled for tax auction after the new year? The county can't allow years of unpaid taxes to accumulate, after all." "I was informed," Ruth replied, remembering Charles's bitter words about Whitman's long-standing desire for their land. "Then you understand why continuing involvement with them might be imprudent." Whitman's tone was reasonable, his eyes cold, especially for someone in your precarious position. Before Ruth could respond, the church door opened and several ladies of the congregation emerged, arms full of evergreen boughs for decorating. They paused at the sight of Ruth standing with the Reverend and the bank owner. "Mrs. Caldwell, we've been waiting," one of them said, her disapproval evident. "The altar needs arranging before noon." "Of course," Ruth replied, grateful for the interruption. "Excuse me, gentlemen." As she moved past them, Whitman spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. "Consider carefully, Mrs. Caldwell. Some choices can't be unmade." The rest of the day passed in a flurry of Christmas preparations. Ruth worked alongside the church ladies, enduring their stiff politeness and occasional pointed comments. She arranged candles, polished silver communion cups, and hung wreaths with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere, on a mountain cabin where, despite hardship, she had found more genuine warmth than in this house of worship. By late afternoon, the church was transformed. Evergreen garlands draped the altar rail, red ribbons brightened the plain wooden pews, and candles waited to be lit for the evening service. As the other women departed to prepare their families' Christmas Eve dinners, Ruth remained behind, completing final tasks. The Reverend had been conspicuously absent all day, leaving her to wonder if he was avoiding her or simply giving her time to reconsider his warning. The church was silent and nearly dark when Ruth finished, only the fading winter light through stained glass illuminating the sanctuary. She stood in the center aisle, looking up at the simple wooden cross above the altar. Samuel had preached his first sermon here, full of hope and purpose. They had been so young then, so certain of their path. "I'm still trying, Samuel," she whispered, "to live as you taught me. But it's harder without you. So much harder." The creak of the door startled her from her reverie. Ruth turned, expecting the Reverend or perhaps one of the church ladies returning for a forgotten item. Instead, Gabriel Harrison stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the snowy brightness outside. "Gabriel," she said, shock evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat, melting in the relative warmth of the church. "I came to warn you," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Whitman's made his move. He's convinced the county sheriff to serve eviction papers on my parents tomorrow morning." "Christmas Day?" Ruth couldn't hide her dismay. "That's deliberate," Gabriel finished grimly. "He knows it will catch us unprepared. No judge will be available until after New Year. By then, he'll have cleared the cabin, claimed any valuables as compensation for taxes owed. But your father's still recovering. Your mother isn't strong enough for travel. Where would they go?" Gabriel's expression darkened. "Whitman suggested the county poorhouse in Helena, said it would be more suitable for their declining years." Ruth felt anger rise in her chest, hot and righteous. "This is about the land, about the copper. He doesn't care what happens to your parents." "No," Gabriel agreed, "he doesn't. How did you learn of this? Overheard Whitman's clerk talking in the general store. The man didn't recognize me. It's been years, and I kept my hat low. Gabriel glanced around the church, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features. I wouldn't have come here, but I didn't know where else to find you. Ruth made a quick decision. Wait here, she said, moving toward the back of the church where her coat hung. I'm coming with you. Gabriel frowned. The Christmas Eve service can proceed without me. Ruth donned her coat and wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck. There are more important matters than lighting candles and singing carols. You'll lose your position, Gabriel warned. Whitman will see to that. Ruth met his gaze steadily. Some things matter more than security. She thought of Samuel, of his unwavering commitment to what was right, regardless of cost. I've been a coward long enough, hiding in this church while pretending to serve God's purpose. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. He nodded once. We need to hurry. Storm's coming in from the north. We'll make the climb difficult if it hits before we reach the cabin. They slipped out the side door, avoiding the main street where townsfolk were beginning to gather for the evening service. The sky to the north had darkened ominously, heavy clouds building over the mountains. Wind gusted intermittently, carrying the scent of snow and a bone-deep cold that promised no mercy. We need to reach my parents before the sheriff, Gabriel said, as they began the ascent. Move what we can to my hunting cabin deeper in the mountains. It's small but defensible, and unknown to Whitman or his men. What about your father's wound? The journey could reopen it. Better a bleeding leg than losing everything. Gabriel's pace was punishing, forcing Ruth to stretch her stride to keep up. I should never have left them alone so long. Should have known Whitman would make his move when I wasn't there to stop him. There was self-recrimination in his voice that Ruth recognized all too well, the same tone she had heard when he spoke of not being with Samuel at the end. You couldn't have known, she said, breath clouding in the frigid air. And you're here now, we both are. Gabriel glanced at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. Why are you doing this, after what the town has already taken from you because of Samuel's choices? Why risk more? The question echoed his earlier one, but this time Ruth had a different answer. Because some battles are worth fighting, even if you know you'll lose. Samuel understood that. I'm beginning to as well. The wind picked up as they climbed higher, driving frozen particles of snow against their faces. The storm was approaching faster than Gabriel had anticipated, clouds swallowing the last light of day. He reached back, grasping Ruth's hand to steady her as the path steepened. Stay close, he called over the rising wind. Easy to get lost in a whiteout. Ruth pressed forward, her legs burning with effort, her face numb with cold. But there was a fire kindling inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Samuel's death. For months she had merely existed, allowing grief and the town's rejection to diminish her to a shadow of herself. Now, climbing this mountain toward uncertainty, but also toward what she knew was right, Ruth felt truly alive again. They were less than half a mile from the cabin when the storm hit in earnest, a wall of white that reduced visibility to mere feet. Gabriel's hand remained firm around hers as he navigated by instinct, following a path he could no longer see but knew by heart. There, he shouted finally, pointing ahead to a faint glow barely visible through the swirling snow. The cabin! They stumbled the final distance, reaching the porch just as a massive gust threatened to knock them off their feet. Gabriel threw his weight against the door, pushing it open, then pulled Ruth inside. The contrast between the howling chaos outside and the sudden stillness within was jarring. Charles and Abigail looked up from their places by the fire, astonishment written across their aged faces. Gabriel, Ruth! Abigail rose quickly. What on earth? We need to pack, Gabriel interrupted, shedding his snow-covered coat. Everything essential. Now. What's happened? Charles demanded, struggling to rise from his chair. Ruth moved to help him while Gabriel explained the situation in terse sentences. The elderly couple's expression shifted from confusion to dismay to resigned determination. How long do we have? Charles asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the news. Until morning if we're lucky, Gabriel replied. The storm might delay the sheriff, but not for long. And where exactly are we going? Abigail asked, already moving to collect their few valuables. My hunting cabin, Gabriel said. It's 3 miles higher up, but sheltered from the worst of the weather. Small, but sound. Ruth helped Abigail gather clothing and necessities, while Gabriel and Charles sorted through tools and supplies. The Bible, Samuel's Bible, was the first thing Abigail wrapped, tucking it securely in a waterproof oilskin. "What about you?" Abigail asked Ruth suddenly. "The Reverend has probably already noticed my absence from the Christmas Eve service." Ruth finished for her. "I've made my choice." Abigail squeezed her hand, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Samuel would be proud," she said softly, "and so are we." As they worked, the storm's fury increased, wind shrieking around the cabin like a living thing seeking entry. Gabriel checked the windows, securing shutters against the onslaught. "We can't travel in this," he said finally, frustration evident in his voice. "Not tonight. We'll have to risk waiting until it passes, then move before dawn." Charles nodded grimly. "If Whitman's men can reach us through this storm, they deserve to find us." They continued preparations, organizing what would be carried, what would be left behind, what would be hidden. Ruth worked alongside them, her earlier exhaustion forgotten in the urgency of their task. This was what Samuel had tried to teach her, that faith without action was hollow, that principles untested by sacrifice were merely words. As midnight approached, Christmas Eve becoming Christmas Day, the four gathered by the fire, their preparations as complete as circumstances allowed. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, a strange calm had settled. Abigail brought out their small store of coffee, brewing it strong and hot. They drank in silence, each lost in private thoughts. "We should read the Christmas story," Abigail suggested finally, "as we always have, regardless of circumstances." Ruth retrieved Samuel's Bible, opening to the Gospel of Luke. The familiar words took on new meaning as she read them aloud. A story of a family seeking shelter in desperate times, of a birth that changed the world, of light entering darkness. When she finished, silence fell again, broken only by the crackling fire and the storm's distant howl. Then Gabriel spoke, his voice rough with emotion that surprised Ruth. Samuel read that same passage to a group of wounded men on Christmas Eve, 1864, Union and Confederate, sharing the same field hospital. Men who hours earlier had been trying to kill each other. He stared into the fire. "I didn't understand then how words could bring peace to such chaos. I think I'm beginning to now." Ruth looked at him, seeing past the rough exterior to the man Samuel had called friend, the man who, despite his own pain, had tried to honor his friend's last wishes, who now risked everything to protect his family. "Samuel believed words had power," she said softly, "but he believed actions spoke louder still. What we do in darkness, when no one sees, that's the true measure of faith." Gabriel met her gaze, something shifting in his winter sky eyes. "Then we'll be measured tomorrow," he said, "when Whitman's men come." Outside, the wind began to ease, the storm gradually spending its fury. By morning, they would face a different kind of storm, one born of greed and power rather than nature's indifference. But as Ruth looked around at the three faces illuminated by firelight, Abigail's gentle determination, Charles's weathered dignity, Gabriel's quiet strength, she felt a certainty that hadn't been there before. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it together. And in that unity, perhaps, lay salvation for them all. Christmas morning dawned clear and merciless, the storm having spent itself during the night. The world outside the Harrison cabin was transformed. Drifts tall as a man blocked the lower windows. Trees bent beneath the weight of new snow, the entire landscape sculpted into curves and hollows of blinding white. The temperature had plummeted further, cold so profound it seemed to crystallize the air itself. Inside, preparations continued in tense silence. Gabriel checked and rechecked the packs they'd assembled, distributing weight according to each person's capacity to carry. Charles, despite his protests, would bear the least, his wound still healing, his strength not what it once was. Abigail would carry food and essential medicines. Ruth, stronger than she appeared after months of manual labor, took clothing and bedding. Gabriel would manage the tools, ammunition, and heavier supplies. "We need to be gone within the hour," Gabriel said, his voice low and focused. "The sheriff will wait for daylight, but once the road's passable, they'll come." Ruth helped Abigail wrap leftover cornbread for the journey, the elderly woman's hands shaking slightly, despite her determined expression. "Do you need to bring anything from your cabin?" Abigail asked. "We're taking you from your home on Christmas Day." The concern touched Ruth deeply. "There's nothing there I can't live without," she assured Abigail. "Everything that matters is here." She meant the people, not possessions, and from Abigail's understanding nod, the older woman knew it. Charles sat near the fire, staring into the flames with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. Gabriel approached his father, kneeling beside his chair. "We need to move soon, Pa," he said gently. "Can you make it?" Charles looked up, his aged face set with the same determination Ruth had seen in his son. "I was walking these mountains before you were born, boy. I'll make it." Gabriel nodded, squeezing his father's shoulder briefly before rising to continue preparations. Ruth noticed the unspoken communication between them. Love disguised as gruffness, worry masked by confidence. The sun had just cleared the eastern ridges, painting the snow-covered landscape in rose and gold, when Gabriel tensed, his head lifting like a wolf scenting danger. "Horses," he said, moving swiftly to the window. "At least 3, coming up the lower trail." Ruth joined him, peering through the frost-edged glass. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, dark shapes moved against the white backdrop, riders pushing their mounts through snow that reached the animals' chests in places. "Whitman?" she asked. Gabriel's expression darkened. "Yes, and Sheriff Davis. Another man I don't recognize." "So soon?" Abigail clutched the bundle she'd been packing. "How did they get through the drifts?" "Determination fueled by greed," Charles said bitterly. "Whitman wouldn't let a little thing like a blizzard stop him from claiming this land." Gabriel moved with sudden urgency and retrieving his rifle from beside the door. "We need to leave. Now, out the back. Through the trees, the snow's deep, but it'll hide our tracks if more falls." "No," Charles said, rising with effort from his chair. "I'm not running from Ezra Whitman. Not again." Gabriel turned to his father, frustration etched on his face. "Pa, this isn't the time for what? Standing our ground? Defending what's ours?" Charles's voice had risen, color flooding his weathered cheeks. "I've worked this land for 40 years, built this cabin with these hands. I'll not skulk away like a thief in the night." "Charles," Abigail said softly, moving to her husband's side. "Gabriel's right. We need to go, for now." "Listen to your mother," Gabriel urged. "This isn't surrender, it's strategy. We retreat, regroup, find a legal way to fight this." Charles looked unconvinced, but the sound of the approaching horses grew louder, forcing a decision. He nodded once, his expression still rebellious. "Fine, but I'll not leave without saying my piece to Whitman first." Before anyone could stop him, Charles moved to a loose floorboard near the hearth, prying it up to reveal a small cavity beneath. From it, he extracted a metal box, tarnished with age. "Pa, we don't have time," Gabriel began. "Make time," Charles interrupted, opening the box with gnarled fingers. "This is what Whitman's really after. Why he's so fired up to get us off this land before spring." Inside the box lay a folded document, yellowed with age but preserved by the dry air beneath the floor. Charles handed it to Gabriel. "Your grandfather's original mineral rights claim, filed before Montana was even a territory. It supersedes anything Whitman's bought or forged." Gabriel unfolded the document carefully, scanning its contents. "This is a federal claim," he said, understanding dawning on his face. "Not subject to local taxation." "Exactly," Charles confirmed. "The copper Whitman's so eager to get his hands on isn't his to take. Never was. That's why I never worried about his tax threats before." "Then why didn't you fight the eviction order?" Ruth asked, bewildered. "Because the original survey maps proving the boundaries were lost in the county fire 10 years back," Charles explained. "Without them, this document's just paper. Whitman knows that. He's been waiting for me to either die or give up so he could move in before anyone could prove otherwise." The sound of horses in the yard cut their conversation short. Gabriel quickly refolded the document, tucking it securely inside his coat. "Out the back," he ordered. "Now. I'll delay them." "Gabriel," Ruth began, but he silenced her with a look that brooked no argument. "Get them to the hunting cabin," he told her, pressing a rough map into her hand. "Follow the ridge east, then north at the lightning-struck pine. The cabin's sheltered in a hollow a half-mile beyond. I'll catch up." Ruth wanted to protest, but the urgency in Gabriel's eyes stopped her. She nodded, taking Abigail's arm. "Come. We need to hurry." As they slipped out the back door, Ruth heard the front door of the cabin crash open, followed by Whitman's voice, falsely cordial but underlined with triumph. "Merry Christmas, Harrison. Sheriff Davis has a gift for you." The trek through deep snow was arduous, especially for Charles and Abigail. Ruth positioned herself between them, supporting first one, then the other, as they forged a path eastward along the ridge. The cold was brutal, seeping through layers of clothing to chill the bone. Charles's breathing grew labored, his face gray with effort, but he pressed forward without complaint. "We need to rest," Ruth finally insisted when they reached the lightning-struck pine Gabriel had mentioned. A massive tree split down the middle by some long-ago storm, its jagged silhouette unmistakable against the sky. "No time," Charles wheezed, but his trembling legs betrayed him. He sank onto a fallen log, Abigail beside him, both of them exhausted. Ruth scanned the back trail anxiously, seeing no sign of pursuit yet, but also no sign of Gabriel. "Just 5 minutes," she conceded, "to catch our breath." As they huddled together against the cold, the distant crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Abigail started, her hand flying to her mouth. Charles straightened, his tired eyes suddenly alert. "Gabriel," he said, half rising before Ruth gently restrained him. "We can't go back," she said, though every instinct urged her to do just that. "We'd only put ourselves in danger too. Gabriel knows these mountains better than anyone. He'll find us." "The girl's right," Abigail said, though her voice quavered. "We must trust Gabriel to handle himself." They waited in tense silence, straining for any further sounds from the direction of the cabin. When none came, Ruth reluctantly urged them onward, following Gabriel's map northward from the landmark tree. The hunting cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a one-room shelter built partially into the hillside for protection from the elements. A stone chimney rose from the sod roof, and the single window was covered with oiled paper rather than glass. But it was solid, defensible, and, most importantly, hidden from casual observation by a stand of thick pines. Ruth helped Charles and Abigail inside, where Gabriel had left basic supplies: firewood stacked neatly, dried meat hanging from rafters, blankets folded on a narrow pallet. She quickly built a fire in the small stone hearth, relief washing through her as warmth began to fill the confined space. "Rest now," she told the elderly couple, helping them settle on the pallet nearest the fire. "I'll keep watch for Gabriel." Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Ruth alternated between tending the fire, checking on Charles and Abigail, who had finally succumbed to exhausted sleep, and watching the approach to the cabin from the doorway. The sun arced across the sky, shadows lengthening as afternoon gave way to early evening. Still no sign of Gabriel. Doubt began to gnaw at her. What if he'd been shot? What if Whitman had him arrested? What if he was lying wounded somewhere along the trail, unable to reach them? As darkness approached, Ruth made a decision. She would go back, at least part way, to look for him. The thought of leaving Charles and Abigail alone worried her, but the thought of Gabriel injured and alone in the falling temperature worried her more. She was checking her coat pockets for the matches she'd brought when a sound outside the cabin froze her in place: the soft crunch of footsteps in snow. Ruth reached for the hunting knife Gabriel had left, positioning herself between the door and the sleeping couple. The door swung open, admitting a blast of frigid air and a figure so covered in snow he was barely recognizable. But Ruth knew him instantly. "Gabriel," she breathed, relief making her voice unsteady. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Blood stained the left sleeve of his coat, and a darkening bruise marked his cheekbone. But he was whole, alive, standing before her with an intensity in his eyes that made Ruth's heart quicken. "You're hurt," she said, moving toward him. "It's nothing. Bullet grazed my arm. Whitman's man can't shoot worth of your damn." Gabriel's voice was rough, but there was an undercurrent of something like elation in it. He looked past Ruth to his parents, his expression softening at the sight of them, safe and sleeping. "They made it all right?" "Tired, but yes," Ruth confirmed. "What happened?" "We heard a shot." Gabriel shed his snow-covered coat, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his wounded arm. "Whitman brought the sheriff, as expected. And a hired gun, man named Rollins I've seen in town. They had the eviction notice, all legal looking." He moved to the fire, extending his hands to the warmth. "I showed them Pa's mineral rights document. Sheriff was interested, but Whitman dismissed it. Said without the original survey maps, it was worthless. Then the shot we heard? Ruth prompted. A grim smile touched Gabriel's lips. Rollins got impatient, decided to hurry things along by threatening me. His mistake. Gabriel rolled his shoulder experimentally, testing the injury. I disarmed him. He took exception, pulled a second gun. Shot went wide, just caught my arm. I convinced him not to try again. The matter-of-fact way Gabriel described the confrontation told Ruth more than words how close he'd come to being killed. And the sheriff allowed this? Davis isn't a bad man, just weak. Once I had Rollins under control, he actually listened when I explained about Pa's claim. Gabriel's expression darkened. Whitman was furious, kept insisting the document was forged, that we had no right to the land, but Davis agreed to delay the eviction until the claim could be properly verified. Ruth exhaled slowly, relief mingling with wariness. So we have time. How much? A week, maybe less. Gabriel met her gaze directly. Whitman won't give up. He's invested too much in getting this land, and he knows that without the survey maps to back Pa's claim, it's his word against ours. Ruth absorbed this, turning over possibilities in her mind. What about Samuel's letter, the one where he mentions buying the tax debt? Gabriel shook his head. That was a personal letter, not a legal document. It mentions the debt, but doesn't specify details. Whitman would dismiss it as hearsay. There must be records somewhere, Ruth insisted. If Samuel paid the tax debt, there would be documentation. Probably in Whitman's bank, Gabriel said, where we have no way of accessing it. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Tonight we need rest. All of us. Ruth nodded, suddenly aware of her own bone-deep fatigue. The emotional and physical strain of the day had depleted her reserves completely. She moved to check Charles's wound, relieved to find it still healing properly, despite the arduous journey. Gabriel watched her tend to his father, a strange expression crossing his face. Something between wonder and regret. You should have been a doctor, he said quietly. Like your father. Ruth smiled faintly. Samuel used to say the same thing. But frontier towns don't take kindly to women physicians. Nurses? Yes. Doctors? No. The Blackfeet would have, Gabriel observed. Their medicine women are respected healers. The mention of the Blackfeet reminded Ruth of the conversation they had yet to complete, the truth about Samuel's death that Gabriel had promised to share. But one look at his exhausted face told her now was not the time. They both needed rest before facing that particular ghost. The cabin had only the one pallet where the elder Harrison slept, in a narrow cot built into the wall. Gabriel insisted Ruth take the cot, while he would sleep on the floor near the fire. You need proper rest too, Ruth argued, especially with that wound. I've slept on worse, Gabriel assured her, many times. Ruth relented, too tired to argue further. She removed her boots, but kept the rest of her clothing on for warmth, slipping beneath the rough blanket on the cot. Gabriel settled himself near the hearth, adding another log to ensure the fire would last through the night. Despite her exhaustion, Ruth found sleep elusive. Her mind raced with the events of the day, with worry for what tomorrow might bring, with awareness of Gabriel's presence just a few feet away. She watched through half-closed eyes as he stared into the flames, his profile strong against the firelight, his expression distant, as if seeing things far removed from the small cabin. Gabriel, she said softly, not wanting to wake his parents. You should rest. He glanced toward her, perhaps surprised to find her still awake. Soon, he promised. Sleep. You've earned it. So have you. Ruth hesitated, then asked the question that had nagged at her since his return. Why did you come back for us? You could have escaped into the high country, started over somewhere else. Gabriel was silent so long Ruth thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, reflective. Because I'm tired of running. From Whitman, from the town, from what happened with Samuel. He looked at her directly. From myself. The raw honesty in his words resonated with something in Ruth, her own weariness of merely surviving, of letting grief and circumstances dictate her choices rather than making them herself. I understand, she said simply. Gabriel nodded, sensing the truth in her response. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from his very soul, he said, "You asked about Samuel, about what happened. I think it's time you knew everything." Ruth sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the cabin's chill. "I'm listening." Gabriel turned back to the fire, as if drawing strength from its steady light. "Samuel and I met at Spotsylvania in '64, as my parents told you. I joined the Union Army at 19 with no medical training beyond what I'd learned from Mother's teaching books. Started as a stretcher bearer, carrying broken men from battlefield to surgeon's tent. By the time I met Samuel, I'd been promoted to medical orderly, then surgical assistant. Not from skill, but from necessity. Too many wounded, too few doctors. I knew how to clean wounds, administer chloroform, hold limbs steady during amputations, stitch what could be saved. Not a doctor's knowledge, just survival skills learned in blood." His voice grew quieter. Samuel was a chaplain, ministering to the dying, those beyond even the surgeon's help. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He was fearless, walking among the wounded while bullets still flew overhead, never flinching, never hesitating. I thought he was either blessed or mad. Ruth smiled softly, recognizing the description of her husband's determination. "Perhaps both." "Perhaps," Gabriel agreed. "We formed an unlikely friendship. He spoke of God's purpose. I spoke of man's folly. But we found common ground in trying to ease suffering where we could." He paused, adding another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow before continuing. "After the war, we went separate ways for a time. The Army surgeon I'd assisted, Dr. Hollister, offered to sponsor my formal medical education, impressed by what I'd learned in the field. But I couldn't bear more death, more suffering. Instead, I returned here trying to find peace in the mountains I'd grown up in. Samuel continued his ministry, eventually meeting you." Ruth nodded. "In St. Louis, my father had just died, leaving me alone. Samuel was passing through, preaching at different churches. He spoke of Montana territory with such passion I felt I already knew it. When you both came west and Samuel began his work with the Blackfeet, we reconnected." Gabriel's voice took on a different quality, tighter, more controlled. "The tribe was suffering. White settlement had pushed them into areas where game was scarce. Government rations were insufficient, often spoiled. Disease was rampant." Ruth remembered the conditions well. The poverty, the illness, the despair that had moved Samuel to action despite the town's disapproval. "Samuel asked for my help," Gabriel continued. "Not as a preacher, he had that covered, but as a medical assistant. My knowledge was limited to battlefield medicine, cleaning wounds, setting bones, recognizing infections, basic surgical aid. But among the Blackfeet camps, even these skills were desperately needed. I was no doctor, but I knew more than most about keeping the dying alive. We worked together for nearly 2 years, traveling to different camps, treating what illnesses we could, teaching basic sanitation." He fell silent for a moment, gathering himself for what came next. "Last winter, news came of a smallpox outbreak in the northern camps. Samuel wanted to go immediately. I was reluctant. We had little vaccine, fewer medicines. What could we really do except expose ourselves to infection?" His voice grew strained. "We argued. For the first time in our friendship, we truly argued." Ruth could picture it. Samuel, driven by conviction that action must be taken regardless of risk. Gabriel, the practical counterpoint, aware of limitations. While we debated, word came that my parents were ill. Pneumonia, brought on by the cold. Gabriel's hands tightened into fists. I had to choose, my family or the Blackfeet. I chose my parents. "As anyone would," Ruth said gently. Gabriel shook his head. "Samuel didn't condemn my choice, but he wouldn't alter his. He went north alone, promising to send word if things worsened." His voice dropped to near a whisper. "I never heard from him, not until it was too late." Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. "What happened?" "The outbreak was worse than reported, much worse. Samuel worked without rest for days, treating the sick, burying the dead. By the time I received word, a young Blackfoot rider braving a snowstorm to find me, Samuel himself was showing symptoms." Gabriel's voice broke slightly. "I left immediately, riding through the storm. But when I reached the camp, Samuel was already delirious with fever. Ruth closed her eyes, the pain of those memories washing over her anew. She had received word of Samuel's illness only after he was beyond hope of recovery, had arrived at his bedside just in time to witness his final hours. I was with him, Gabriel said, his gaze fixed on the flames. Before you arrived, he was lucid, briefly. He gave me the letter you found, had dictated it to a young Blackfoot woman who could write English, made me promise to deliver it to you. But you didn't, Ruth said, without accusation. No. Gabriel finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting firelight and something deeper. Sorrow, regret, a pain that hadn't diminished with time. Ruth moved from the cot, coming to kneel beside him at the hearth. No, she said firmly. You made a choice Samuel himself understood. He wrote it in his letter to you, and I do not blame you for not being there. The decision was mine, as were the consequences. Words of absolution he didn't live to see delivered, Gabriel countered bitterly. Words he meant, Ruth insisted. Samuel never said things he didn't mean, especially not at the end. She hesitated, then added, and there's something you don't know, something I didn't know until after he was gone. Gabriel looked at her questioningly. Samuel knew he was susceptible to smallpox, Ruth explained, the admission still painful after all these months. As a child, he'd been inoculated, but it hadn't taken properly. His mother told me, after his death, he'd always been warned to be especially cautious around the disease. Gabriel stared at her, comprehension slowly dawning. Yet he went anyway, knowing the risk. Ruth nodded. That's what he meant in his letter about pride making him believe he alone could save them. He knew the danger better than anyone, but went because he couldn't bear to do nothing. She smiled sadly. That was Samuel, always believing that faith required action, regardless of cost. And all this time, Gabriel trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. All this time, you've blamed yourself for a choice Samuel made with full knowledge of the consequences. Ruth reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing his hand, just as he said in his letter. Gabriel looked down at her hand on his, then back to her face, searching for something. Forgiveness, perhaps, or understanding. Whatever he saw there seemed to ease something inside him, a tension he'd carried so long it had become part of his being. There's more, he said after a moment, about the tax debt Whitman's using to claim the land. Ruth waited, sensing they were approaching another truth long hidden. Shortly before he fell ill, Samuel came to me with a proposal. He'd learned that my parents' tax debt had accumulated to the point where Whitman could legally claim the property. He offered to pay it, had saved money from his missionary stipend specifically for that purpose. That sounds like Samuel, Ruth said, remembering her husband's generosity, often exercised without her knowledge. I refused at first, Gabriel continued, proud, like my father. But Samuel was persuasive, said it wasn't charity but investment in the future. A faint smile crossed his lips. He had this vision of building a proper clinic on our land someday, a place where anyone could come for treatment, regardless of race or means. He wanted me to run it, using what I'd learned during and after the war. Ruth felt her throat tighten with emotion. The vision was so perfectly Samuel, practical compassion coupled with long-term thinking. What happened to the plan? Samuel said he'd handle the paperwork, make sure everything was legal. He was going to tell me the details after returning from the Blackfeet camps. Gabriel's expression darkened. But then the outbreak happened, and afterward, there were more pressing concerns than the property taxes. So you don't know if he actually paid the debt, Ruth concluded. No, and without proof, Whitman can proceed as if the debt still stands. Gabriel sighed heavily. That's the full truth, Ruth. Every bit of it I've carried alone until now. Ruth was silent, absorbing everything he'd shared. The pieces fit together now, Gabriel's guilt, Whitman's determination, the mystery of Samuel's final days. But something still nagged at her awareness, some connection not quite made. The clinic, she said suddenly. Samuel's vision. He mentioned it to me once, though not specifically on your land. Said he was investing in the future of medicine in Montana. I thought he meant donations to the territorial hospital. Gabriel straightened, a new alertness in his posture. When was this? Just before he left for the Blackfeet camps, the last time I saw him healthy. Ruth tried to recall the exact conversation. He was organizing his papers, said he was putting affairs in order before the journey. I teased him about being morbid. His papers, Gabriel echoed. What happened to them after his death? Ruth thought back to those blurry days of grief and loss. Some went to the church board. Personal effects came to me. Records of his missionary work went to a sponsoring organization back east. She paused, remembering. There was a strong box he kept in our bedroom. It disappeared during the move to the smaller cabin. I assumed the bank took it along with the house. Or someone at the bank took it, Gabriel suggested, his eyes intent. Someone who might have recognized its potential value. Understanding dawned in Ruth's mind. Whitman, if Samuel did pay the tax debt, proof might have been in that box. Proof Whitman would want to ensure never surfaced. Exactly. Gabriel rose, pacing the small confines of the cabin. We need to find that box or any record of the transaction. Without it, Whitman's claim stands. But how, Ruth asked. The bank records are private, and if Whitman himself has the box hidden somewhere. Gabriel stopped pacing, a determined expression settling over his features. Then we go where records can't be hidden or altered. The Territorial Land Office in Helena would have copies of all legal transactions involving property. If Samuel paid the debt, it would be registered there. Helena is days away, Ruth pointed out, even if the weather holds. And we can't leave your parents alone, not with Whitman still determined to claim the land. Before Gabriel could respond, Charles's voice came from the pallet, startling them both. Don't make plans around us, boy. We're old, not helpless. The elderly man had propped himself up on one elbow, clearly having heard at least part of their conversation. Beside him, Abigail's eyes were also open, watching them with a mixture of concern and resolve. Pa, how long have you been awake? Gabriel asked. Long enough, Charles replied, to hear what should have been said months ago. His gaze shifted to Ruth. Samuel was a good man, better than most, including me. Charles, Abigail chided gently. It's true, he insisted. I wasn't keen on Gabriel working with Indians, no matter how noble the cause. Too set in my ways, too afraid of what the town would think. Regret etched deeper lines into his weathered face. If I'd been less stubborn, maybe Gabriel would have gone with Samuel that last time. You were ill, Gabriel reminded him. You needed me. Needed you, yes, but not as much as those people Samuel was trying to help. Charles shook his head. Pride. Mine, yours. Got in the way of what was right. Samuel saw clearer than any of us. Abigail sat up beside her husband, reaching for his hand. What matters now is what we do next. And I agree with Gabriel, the land office is our best hope. But getting there, Ruth began, will be your task, Abigail interrupted firmly. Yours and Gabriel's. Charles and I will manage here. We've survived worse than hiding in a cabin for a few days. Gabriel looked uncomfortable with the suggestion. Whitman could return, and in this cold, we have shelter, fire, food, Charles pointed out, and I may be old, but I can still handle a rifle if necessary. His expression softened. Son, this is your fight now, yours and Ruth's. The future Samuel envisioned. It wasn't for us. It was for you two. Ruth felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the implication, but Gabriel didn't seem to notice, too focused on the practicalities of the plan. Even if we left at first light, he said, thinking aloud, it would take at least 3 days to reach Helena in these conditions. Another day to search records, then 3 back, a week minimum. Time the sheriff has already granted us, Ruth reminded him. It's our best chance, Gabriel. He looked at her, indecision warring with hope in his eyes. It would mean leaving everything you know. Your position at the church is surely gone by now. The town will view you as having chosen sides against them. I made that choice when I followed you up the mountain, Ruth said simply, and I don't regret it. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a softening, a warming like ice beginning to thaw under spring's sun. He nodded once, decision made. We'll leave at first light, travel light and fast. The rest of the evening passed in preparation. Gabriel cleaned and bandaged his wound properly, accepting Ruth's assistance without the resistance she'd expected. They packed supplies for the journey, enough food for 6 days, matches, extra clothing, layers against the cold. Charles insisted Gabriel take the mineral rights document. in case additional proof of their claim was needed. By the time they settled for sleep, a plan had formed. Gabriel and Ruth would travel to Helena, seek records at the Territorial Land Office, and return with whatever evidence they could find before the sheriff's deadline expired. Charles and Abigail would remain hidden at the hunting cabin, conserving supplies and strength for whatever confrontation might come. This time, Ruth fell asleep quickly, the emotional and physical exhaustion of the day finally claiming her. Her last conscious awareness was of Gabriel settling nearby, his presence somehow both comforting and exhilarating. Like standing at the edge of a precipice, afraid yet eager to discover what lay below. Dawn came with painful brightness, sunlight reflecting off snow, creating a dazzling brilliance that hurt the eyes. Ruth and Gabriel prepared in near silence, each absorbed in thoughts of the journey ahead. Abigail packed extra cornbread for them, while Charles offered gruff advice about trails and passes that might be navigable despite the snow. The parting was brief but emotional. Abigail embraced Ruth tightly, whispering, "You've been the daughter I always wanted. Come back to us." Charles shook Gabriel's hand, then pulled him into a rough hug. Find what Samuel left. Finish what he started. Then they were gone, trudging through snow that sometimes reached their knees, heading westward toward the main trail that would eventually lead to Helena. The cold was intense, but the sky remained clear. Small mercies in a Montana winter. They traveled in comfortable silence for the first few hours, focusing on making distance while daylight lasted. Gabriel set a pace that challenged Ruth without overwhelming her, occasionally extending a hand at difficult passages. By midday, they had reached the main trail, now packed enough by previous travelers to make progress easier. "We'll make better time from here," Gabriel observed as they paused for a brief rest. "With luck, we might reach Jackson's Way by nightfall. There's an old trapper's cabin there where we can shelter." Ruth nodded, chewing a piece of jerky to restore energy. The physical exertion had warmed her, but she knew the temperature would drop precipitously once the sun began to set. "Do you really think we'll find proof in Helena?" she asked, the question that had lingered since their decision to make the journey. Gabriel considered before answering. Samuel was methodical, especially with matters he considered important. If he paid the tax debt, he would have ensured it was properly recorded. The question is whether Whitman found a way to alter those records as well. Could he reach that far? Possibly. Money speaks loudly in territorial politics, but falsifying federal land records is a serious crime. Even Whitman might hesitate to cross that line. They continued walking, the trail gradually descending toward the valley that would lead them west. As they traveled, Ruth found herself studying Gabriel when he wasn't looking. The set of his shoulders, the economical grace of his movements, the profile that could have been carved from the mountains themselves. She was beginning to see past the wild man exterior to the person beneath. Thoughtful, haunted, but fundamentally honorable. "You're staring," Gabriel observed without turning. Ruth felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. "Thinking," she corrected, "about how different you are from what the town believes." "And what do they believe?" He glanced back at her, a hint of wry amusement in his eyes. "You know what they say," Ruth replied simply, matching his stride as the trail widened enough for them to walk side by side. "They're not entirely wrong," Gabriel admitted. "After the war, after Samuel's death, solitude seemed preferable to facing a world that made little sense." "And now?" Ruth asked quietly. Gabriel was silent for several paces. "Now I'm beginning to think Samuel was right, that hiding from the world solves nothing, that a man must stand for something beyond his own survival." They reached Jackson's Way just as twilight deepened into true darkness, the promised trapper's cabin a welcome sight after hours of challenging travel. It was smaller than Gabriel's hunting cabin, barely more than a shelter with a crude hearth and a single sleeping platform, but it offered protection from the elements. Gabriel quickly built a fire while Ruth arranged their bedrolls side by side for maximum warmth. They ate a simple meal of jerky and cornbread, too tired for much conversation. Outside, the temperature plummeted, the clear sky promising a night of brutal cold. "We should sleep," Gabriel said, banking the fire to last through the night. "Tomorrow will be harder. The trail climbs before dropping into the next valley." Ruth nodded, settling into her bedroll, fully clothed except for her boots. Gabriel did the same, lying beside her close enough for shared warmth but with a careful space between them. Despite her exhaustion, Ruth found herself unexpectedly alert, aware of Gabriel's proximity in a way that had nothing to do with practicality. In the dancing firelight, she studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw partially hidden by his beard, the curve of his mouth that rarely smiled but when it did, transformed his entire face. "Gabriel," she said softly, "thank you for trusting me with the truth about Samuel." He turned his head toward her, his eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "I should have told you long ago." "Perhaps we both needed time," Ruth suggested, "to be ready to hear truths that might have been too painful earlier." The mention of Samuel between them felt different now. Not a barrier, but a connection, a shared memory that bound rather than separated. "He would be pleased," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to see us working together like this." Something flickered in Gabriel's eyes, an emotion Ruth couldn't quite name. "Yes," he agreed softly. He would. They fell silent, the crackling fire and the occasional settling of logs the only sounds in the small cabin. Outside, the vast Montana night stretched endless and star-filled above the snow-covered landscape, while inside, two people drawn together by loss and purpose found unexpected comfort in each other's presence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers as they continued their journey to Helena. But for now, in this moment of quiet connection, Ruth felt something she had thought lost forever after Samuel's death. Hope, fragile but undeniable, like the first green shoot breaking through winter ground, reaching toward the promise of spring. 3 days of arduous travel brought Ruth and Gabriel to Helena, the territorial capital standing stark against winter's grip. Exhaustion lined their faces as they made their way through streets bustling with the anticipation of Montana's imminent statehood. The land office, a square brick building with the federal eagle mounted above its doors, loomed before them like a final hurdle. "Are you ready?" Gabriel asked, his voice low. Ruth nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Whatever we find, we face it together." Inside, they were directed to a clerk with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains darkening his fingers. His initial disinterest gave way to alert attention when Gabriel presented Charles's mineral rights document. "Harrison property in Clearwater Valley? Let me check our records." The clerk disappeared into a back room lined with leather-bound ledgers. While waiting, Ruth noticed a framed newspaper clipping on the wall announcing Montana's upcoming admission to the Union. "November 8th, she read aloud. "Montana becomes a state." "9 months too late for us," Gabriel remarked grimly. The clerk returned, not with a single document, but with a thick folder. "Found something interesting," he said, spreading papers across the counter. "The Harrison claim is quite complex. The original mineral rights are indeed valid, federal, not territorial. But there's more." He pointed to a deed transfer dated 8 months prior. "Your property has additional protection. Someone purchased supplementary rights to the adjoining parcel and tied them legally to the original claim." Gabriel leaned forward, studying the signature at the bottom. His breath caught audibly. "Samuel Caldwell," the clerk confirmed, glancing at Ruth. "Any relation?" "My husband," Ruth whispered, her fingers trembling as she touched the familiar handwriting. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell, your husband did more than pay the tax debt on the Harrison land. He purchased the connecting 60 acres in his own name, then created a legal covenant binding the two properties. According to this document, neither parcel can be seized or sold independently of the other." Gabriel looked at Ruth, astonishment evident in his expression. "He didn't just save my parents' land. He expanded it." "There's a letter too," the clerk added, extracting a sealed envelope from the folder. "Left with instructions to deliver it to either Charles Harrison or Samuel Caldwell upon inquiry about these properties." The letter bore Samuel's handwriting, "For the future." Back in their modest room at a boarding house, Ruth broke the seal with unsteady hands. Gabriel sat beside her, their shoulders touching as she unfolded the pages. "My dearest friends," Samuel had written, "if you are reading this, then circumstances have forced the revelation of my plans sooner than I intended. The land I've secured adjoining the Harrison property is meant for what Gabriel and I often discussed, a place of healing open to all people regardless of means or heritage. The territorial government has provisionally approved our application for a medical outpost, conditional upon staffing by a qualified practitioner. Ruth paused, emotion tightening her throat. Gabriel has the skills, though he doubts himself. Ruth has the compassion, though she underestimates her strength. Together, you could accomplish what neither could alone. This is not obligation but opportunity, to build something meaningful from loss, to create light where darkness has prevailed. Gabriel's hand found Ruth's, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Whether you choose this path or another, know that the land is secured against those who would exploit it. My final act of ministry, perhaps, was ensuring that copper deposits benefit the community rather than merely enriching the powerful. The accompanying documents include construction plans we drafted and supply requisitions already approved by the Territorial Health Department. Ruth looked up at Gabriel, seeing in his eyes the same stunned recognition. Samuel hadn't just paid a debt or bought land. He'd laid groundwork for an entire future, anticipating obstacles, creating opportunities. He knew, Gabriel said softly. Even then, he was preparing for the possibility he wouldn't return. The final paragraph brought fresh tears to Ruth's eyes. Whatever choices brought us to this moment, know that I considered you both my family. Love doesn't divide through sharing, but multiplies. Find comfort in each other. Build something worthy together. This is my final prayer for you both. They sat in silence as twilight gathered outside their window, Samuel's words resonating between them like the lingering note of a bell. What do we do? Ruth finally asked. Gabriel's eyes met hers, winter blue, but warm now with something she hadn't seen before. We honor him. We build what he envisioned. Together. Their return journey was hastened by determination and improved weather. 4 days later, they crested the ridge above Clearwater, legal documents secure inside Gabriel's coat. The town below looked smaller somehow, its power over them diminished by the truth they now carried. At the hunting cabin, they found Charles and Abigail safe but anxious, having spotted Whitman and several men searching the area 2 days prior. The sheriff's deadline expires tomorrow, Charles warned. Whitman won't wait longer. Let him come, Gabriel said, a new confidence in his stance. We're ready. That evening, they spread Samuel's documents across the small table. Deeds, plans, approvals for a medical outpost that would serve both the town and the Blackfeet. Samuel thought of everything, Abigail marveled, studying the detailed drawings. Not everything, Ruth corrected gently. He couldn't know what would happen after he was gone, but he gave us the tools to build our own path forward. Gabriel caught her gaze across the table, holding it longer than necessary. Something had shifted between them during their journey, unspoken yet undeniable, like spring currents moving beneath winter ice. Morning brought the confrontation they'd prepared for. Whitman, Sheriff Davis, and 3 men from town approached the Harrison cabin where Gabriel had deliberately lit the chimney smoke as a signal. "Harrison!" Whitman called, satisfaction edging his voice. "Time's up. The sheriff has orders to remove you by sundown." Gabriel emerged alone, standing tall on the porch. "Mr. Whitman, we've been expecting you." Ruth watched through the window as Whitman's expression shifted from triumph to wariness at Gabriel's calm demeanor. "The property is forfeit for unpaid taxes," Whitman declared, "unless you've somehow found gold up in these mountains." His attempt at humor fell flat among his companions. "Better than gold," Gabriel replied, producing the documents from inside his coat. "Federal mineral rights that supersede your tax claims, and proof that all back taxes were paid in full by Samuel Caldwell nearly a year ago." Sheriff Davis dismounted, approaching to examine the papers. His eyebrows rose as he read. "These appear genuine, Ezra. Federal seal and everything." Whitman snatched the documents, his face darkening as he scanned them. "Forgeries," he spat, "clearly fabricated." "Verified by the Territorial Land Office in Helena," Gabriel countered, "with duplicate copies filed there and with the Federal Marshal's Office." Ruth chose this moment to step outside, joining Gabriel on the porch. "There's more, Mr. Whitman. Documentation of your repeated attempts to seize land through falsified tax records." The territorial prosecutor found it most interesting. Whitman's face paled beneath his winter-reddened cheeks. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Ruth met his gaze steadily. "Samuel kept meticulous records, including your refusal to acknowledge his payment of the Harrison tax debt, a serious offense, I'm told, interfering with federal mineral claims. Sheriff Davis shifted uncomfortably. Ezra, if what they're saying is true, it's a bluff, Whitman insisted, though doubt had crept into his voice. Then arrest us, Gabriel challenged quietly. Take us to Helena. Let a judge examine all the evidence. I'm certain the territorial governor would be interested in such a case, with statehood so close at hand. The mention of the governor seemed to deflate Whitman entirely. His gaze darted between Ruth and Gabriel, calculating his diminishing options. This isn't over, Harrison, he finally growled, thrusting the documents back at the sheriff. Enjoy your worthless mountain while you can. They watched in silence as Whitman mounted his horse and rode away, the other men following with backward glances of confusion and reluctant respect. Sheriff Davis lingered, handing the papers back to Gabriel. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm glad it turned out this way. Never did sit right, evicting folks in winter. After the sheriff departed, Ruth and Gabriel stood together on the porch, watching the riders disappear down the snow-covered trail. The mountain around them seemed to exhale, tension draining from its slopes. It's really over? Abigail asked from the doorway, Charles leaning on his cane beside her. Not over, Gabriel answered, turning to face his parents. Just beginning. By spring, the snow retreated up the mountainside, revealing ground ready for new growth. On the ridge where Samuel had purchased land adjoining the Harrison property, construction began on a modest building that would serve as both clinic and home. Ruth worked alongside Gabriel, Charles, and a small crew of men, some from town, others Blackfeet who remembered Samuel's kindness. Attitudes in Clearwater hadn't changed overnight, but necessity often overcame prejudice. When the only doctor within 50 miles left for California, even the most reluctant townspeople reconsidered their stance toward the emerging clinic on the ridge. On a warm May evening, with construction nearly complete, Ruth found Gabriel alone on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in hues of gold and amber. Samuel would have loved this view, she said, joining him at the railing. Yes, Gabriel agreed, though he'd be more interested in the clinic itself. Always practical, Samuel. Not entirely practical, Ruth smiled, thinking of her husband's boundless idealism. He believed in impossible things until they became possible. Gabriel turned to her, his face softened in the evening light. Like us, he said quietly, standing here together, building this place. Like us, Ruth echoed, her heart quickening at the intensity in his gaze. They had worked side by side through winter's end and spring's emergence, their partnership evolving from necessity to choice, from shared purpose to something deeper. Neither had spoken of it directly, respecting the ghost of Samuel that had first connected them. Ruth, Gabriel began, his voice carrying an unfamiliar uncertainty. I've been thinking about what Samuel wrote, about finding comfort in each other. So have I, she admitted. I never expected this, he continued, gesturing between them. After the war, after everything, I thought my life would be solitude. Then Samuel brought me back to humanity. And you, he paused, searching for words. You showed me how to live again, not just survive. Ruth stepped closer, emboldened by the vulnerability in his expression. Samuel knew us both better than we knew ourselves. Perhaps he saw something we couldn't yet see. Gabriel's hand found hers, warm and certain. I know it's not been long enough by proper standards. I know there's still talk in town, but I can't imagine building this life, this clinic, this future, without you beside me as more than Samuel's widow or my partner in his legacy. Then don't, Ruth said simply, her free hand rising to touch his bearded cheek. Some journeys begin long before we recognize we're on them. Ours started with blood on snow and a Bible passed between friends. It's time we acknowledge where it's led us. When their lips finally met, it felt like neither an ending nor a betrayal, but a continuation, a new chapter in a story Samuel had helped write but couldn't complete. That summer, Montana prepared for statehood, while the clinic on the ridge welcomed its first patients. Ruth and Gabriel were married in a simple ceremony beside the new building, with Charles and Abigail witnessing their vows. Ruth wore a dress of deep blue rather than traditional white, a small acknowledgement that this was not her first love, but her second, no less genuine for coming after grief. The sign they hung above the clinic door read simply, Caldwell Harrison Medical Outpost. Below it in smaller letters, all welcome. It wasn't grand or imposing, but like the love that had created it, it would built to endure. A light kindled from loss, a fire born in the soul of winter, warming all who sought its shelter.